The morning I moved into my quiet mountain cabin, I barely had time to unpack my bags before 3 angry HOA board members barged through the front gate, yelling that I was trespassing on their land. But what they didn't know was that I not only owned that land, they were actually renting all their homes from me. When I first arrived at the mountain cabin, I felt a deep kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The wind rustled through tall pine trees. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires, and the air smelled like rain-soaked earth. I stepped out of my truck, looked around at the open land, and smiled to myself. I had finally made it. After years of work, planning, and more paperwork than I care to remember, I was here. My cabin, my land, my quiet life, finally beginning. The cabin wasn't new or fancy. It was old, with weathered wood and a rusty tin roof that groaned in the breeze, but it was solid, standing proud at the top of the ridge with a porch that offered a view of the forest below and the subdivision down the hill. I bought the land over a year ago, 300 acres of beautiful wilderness sand. I had leased part of it to a neighborhood HOA called Foxtail Ridge. They had built 20 houses near the base, a whole planned community complete with paved streets, fancy mailboxes, and neatly trimmed lawns. I was fine with it. They rented the land. I stayed up here at the cabin. We had no problems. Until now, I spent my first night in the cabin unpacking and watching the stars. The forest was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I slept without setting an alarm or worrying about emails. That peace, however, didn't last long. It was just after 8 a.m. the next morning when I heard tires on the gravel. 3 vehicles, a black SUV, a silver truck, and a minivan pulled up at the base of my porch. Doors slammed. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, wondering who in the world could be visiting this early. 3 people were already marching up the porch steps like they owned the place. A woman in her 50s led the group. She wore a crisp blouse, carried a clipboard, and had the kind of expression that made it clear she wasn't here for a neighborly chat. "You can't be here," she said sharply, not even bothering to say hello. I blinked. "Excuse me. This land belongs to Foxtail Ridge," she continued, stepping closer to me like I was some kind of squatter. "You're trespassing." I looked at her, stunned for a moment, before letting out a small laugh. "You must be confused," I said calmly. "I own this land." She raised her eyebrows and scoffed. "I'm Carol Turner, president of the Foxtail Ridge HOA, and she gestured to the men behind her, "represent the interests of this entire community. You need to leave immediately. You've built a structure here without HOA approval. That's a violation." Now I was really confused. "You mean this structure?" I asked, gesturing to the cabin behind me. "Yes," she said, scanning the property like she was conducting an inspection. "This entire setup, we weren't notified. We didn't approve this cabin or that." She pointed to my newly installed porch swing, that eyesore. I tried not to laugh again. I didn't want to embarrass her. "Not yet, Carol," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "This cabin's been here for over 40 years, and I didn't build it. I bought it, along with all the land you're standing on, every inch of it. You lease your subdivision from me." She blinked. "That's impossible." "No, it's not," I said, pulling a small folder out from a storage box beside the door. "I have the deed, the transfer documents, and the original lease agreement your board signed last year. You lease 65 acres at the base of this ridge. I've owned this entire property since February of last year. I'm Daniel Granger." One of the men behind Hurtle in a golf polo narrowed his eyes. "Wait, you're that Granger?" Carol's face went pale. "No," she whispered, her voice tight. "That can't be right. The previous owner never said anything about this. We assumed that he sold you the land." I finished for her. "Yet he didn't. He sold it to me. You leased your homes, and I've never once interfered until today." She clutched her clipboard like it might protect her from embarrassment. "We need to review this with our attorney." "You should," I said, "because storming onto someone else's land and making legal threats, that won't end well." With that, I stepped back inside and closed the door, but I could hear the conversation that followed on the porch. One of the men muttered something about verifying paperwork. Carol sounded like she was losing her grip, talking about enforcing HOA rules even up here. They eventually left, but not before sticking a paper to the side of my mailbox. It read, "Notice of violation, unauthorized structure." I crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash. By the next morning, word had spread. I went into the town store for some supplies and found people whispering when I walked in. A clerk who recognized me from my land deal asked, "What did you do to the HOA?" I just smiled and said, "Apparently, I'm their worst nightmare, a landlord who moved back in." Back at the cabin, things were escalating fast. I noticed a couple of SUVs circling the ridge road. One even parked at the edge of my property, trying to get a better view. That afternoon, Carol returned, but this time with 2 more board members and a camera. They filmed my front porch like they were building a case. I walked out calmly. "You're not allowed to record on private property," I said. "We're gathering evidence." Carol snapped. "We believe your documents are forged." "Then call the county," I told her. "They'll confirm the ownership." I filed everything publicly. Carol didn't respond, but that night I received an official letter delivered by courier. Inside was a formal cease and desist from the HOA, accusing me of impersonating a property owner, disrupting the community, and violating HOA bylaws. I laughed out loud. The very next morning I called my lawyer. His name was Eddie, a sharp no-sense guy who had helped me close the original land deal. He reviewed the letter and chuckled. "This is gold," Eddie said. "You want me to respond?" "Not yet," I said. "Let them keep digging." Eddie paused. "You want to play it that way?" I smiled. "Yeah, I want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes." And so I waited. Sure enough, the HOA didn't back off. Carol sent out emails to all residents, warning them about a land scammer occupying unauthorized property. She claimed I was dangerous, that I might take control of the community, and encouraged people to report any interactions with me. Some residents believed her, others did in single quotes T. One afternoon I saw a couple walking their dog near the trail that led to the ridge. They looked cautious but waved politely. I waved back. That was when I realized not everyone down there was part of the problem, just the ones in charge. But that wouldn't last much longer, because if they thought they could push me off my own mountain, they were in for the shock of their lives. The morning air was unusually still, and I had the odd feeling of being watched. I stood on my porch sipping black coffee, my eyes drifting across the forest down to the subdivision below. The ridge offered a perfect view of the neatly packed neighborhood, 20 homes, all designed in that same cookie-cutter style, with tiny manicured lawns, little white fences, and perfectly spaced mailboxes. It looked peaceful from up here to peaceful, especially considering how much noise the HOA had made since I moved in just a few days ago. I had hoped that after our first meeting, Carol and her board would simmer down. I had made it clear that I owned the land, had the paperwork, and wasn't planning to leave. But instead of admitting their mistake, they doubled down. I got my answer when a certified letter arrived via courier later that day. Inside was a packet stapled together, with a cover sheet titled Notice of Immediate Action from Foxdale Ridge HOA. The language was dramatic. Phrases like illegal occupancy, community threat, and unauthorized residency were bolded throughout. I raised an eyebrow and sat down at the kitchen table to read the whole thing. According to the document, the HOA had officially voted to revoke permission for me to be on the ridge. They planned to fine me $500 per day for not with community guidelines. They even threatened to have my utilities cut off. Ironic, since I had my own well and solar panels and wasn't connected to any of their services. I chuckled and slid the letter aside. It was clearly meant to scare me off, but it only made me more confident. What Carol and her board didn't realize was that the more they pushed, the more ground they were about to lose. I had kept quiet for long enough. I didn't want to embarrass them. I'd been willing to let things go if they had just acknowledged their mistake. But if they wanted a war, they'd picked the wrong man to fight. Later that afternoon, I took a trip into town to visit the county recorder's office. I made a few copies of the land deed, the subdivision lease agreement, and my original property transfer documents. I even printed out the plat map showing that their neighborhood sat right inside my land boundaries. I wasn't doing it for me. I already knew the truth. I was preparing to educate a very stubborn group of people. When I returned home, I saw a small group of HOA members gathered near the bottom of my driveway. Carol was among them, standing beside a man in a tight blue polo shirt with a Bluetooth earpiece stuck in his ear. He looked like he had watched one too many lawyer shows on TV. They were talking animatedly, glancing toward the cabin and pointing. I pulled into the driveway slowly and parked. As soon as I got out, Carol marched toward me, waving a sheet of paper in the air. "You've been formally notified," she said. "You are in violation of 7 HOA articles." 7. I held up my hand. Calm as ever. "Carol, do you realize this isn't how any of this works? You're living on protected HOA land," she snapped. "You never submitted plans for approval. You didn't go through the architectural committee, and you certainly didn't go through us to install a porch swing." I almost laughed. "It's my land." She ignored me. "And we've just passed a new bylaw. One is allowed to live higher than the second elevation tier. Your cabin violates that. You need to vacate within 72 hours. Now I did laugh. "You passed a bylaw to try and kick me off my own ridge." The man in the polo stepped forward. "You may want to reconsider your tone," he said, trying to sound intimidating. "We're escalating this legally. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll file an injunction." I pulled out the packet I'd just picked up from the recorder's office and handed it to Carol. "Here, this is the deed for all 300 acres, including Foxtail Ridge. You'll find your HOA lease agreement in there too. Your board signed it. That land you think you control, you lease it from me." Carol looked down at the papers, clearly flustered. "We were told the previous owner dissolved this lease." "He didn't," I said firmly. "I bought the land with the lease in place. It's good for 15 more years unless terminated for breach." Polo-shirt guy snatched the papers from her hands and flipped through them. His face fell as he scanned the documents. "We'll need to have our attorney review this." "Do that," I said, "but in the meantime, any more false notices or harassment, and I'll be forced to issue legal warnings of my own, including trespassing charges." That quieted them. They backed away slowly, murmuring to each other. As I watched them go, I realized something important. These people weren't used to being challenged. They were used to getting their way. Two homeowners bending over backwards to avoid fines, rules, or public embarrassment. But I wasn't one of them. I wasn't under their authority, and that made me dangerous in their eyes. By the end of the week, things had taken a turn. Flyers, it started appearing around the neighborhood. One of my friends in town who lived in Foxdale Ridge texted me a picture of one. Warning: dangerous individual occupying illegal property above Foxdale Ridge. HOA is working with authorities to remove trespasser. It included a grainy photo of me walking out of my cabin with a toolbox, looking like I'd just robbed a bank. Below that was a hotline number and a message urging residents to report suspicious activity. I couldn't believe how far they were taking this. It was slander, plain and simple. I called Eddie again. "They're walking a fine line," he said. "We can either hit them with a cease and desist for defamation now or wait until they dig themselves a little deeper." I thought about it for a second. Let's wait. One more push. Eddie agreed. 2 days later, I got what I was waiting for. A deputy sheriff pulled up to my property in a county-marked SUV. I walked down to meet him. He was young, polite, and clearly annoyed that he'd been sent out here for something so trivial. "Mr. Granger?" he asked. "That's me. Mind if I come up for a chat?" "Of course not," I said. "Coffee?" he smiled. "Wouldn't say no." We sat on the porch as I explained everything. I showed him the documents. He looked them over carefully, nodded, and then leaned back with a sigh. "Yeah," he said. "This checks out. You own it. Every inch. I'm sorry, but we've been getting complaints, anonymous reports saying you're squatting here, that you're threatening the neighborhood." I shook my head. "This isn't about me being a threat. This is about control. They can't control me, and that's making them panic." The deputy stood up and nodded again. "Far as I'm concerned, you're fine. I'll note it in the report. If they keep harassing you, let us know." I thanked him, and he left. The moment his SUV disappeared around the bend, I knew what I had to do next. The time for quiet was over. They wanted a battle. Fine, but I was going to fight it the right way through facts, truth, and the law. I wasn't just defending myself. I was about to remind every single resident of Foxtail Ridge who really owned the ground beneath their feet they wanted to act like I was trespassing. They were about to learn they'd been living under my roof all along. The sun had barely come up the next morning when I started hearing from residents. The first message came through email. A man named Thomas, who lived in Lot 8 of Foxtail Ridge, reached out to me directly. He introduced himself politely and apologized for the chaos. "I didn't realize you were the property owner," he wrote. "Carol's been telling everyone you're dangerous. She said you faked the land sale, but a few of us started asking questions, and well, let's just say the story is starting to fall apart." I replied right away and told him I appreciated his honesty. It wasn't his fault the HOA board had gone rogue. He asked if I'd be willing to meet with a few residents to clear the air. That gave me an idea, one I'd been holding on to for days. It was time to go public that same day. I drove into town, printed copies of the land deed, lease agreement, and subdivision boundaries, again this time enough for every homeowner in Foxtail Ridge. I also had a statement printed on a single sheet of paper. Nothing dramatic, just facts. It included my full name, a copy of the deed, the date I purchased the land, and a breakdown of what the HOA's lease allowed and what it didn't. I made it clear I wasn't trying to kick anyone out or interfere with how they lived. I just wanted the harassment to stop, and I was tired of being painted as the villain. I slid each packet into a manila envelope, labeled them by house number, and started hand-delivering them myself. By the time I hit the 5th house, people were opening their doors before I even knocked. Some were friendly, others were cautious, but everyone had questions. At Lot 12, an older woman named Janet invited me inside for lemonade. She'd lived there for 9 years and said she'd never seen anything like this. "They act like they're running a military base," she said, shaking her head. "Last year I got fined $200 for hanging wind chimes. Said they violated the sound policy." "Seriously?" I said, sipping the lemonade. "Dead serious," she said. "I paid it just to shut them up. They said if I didn't, I'd lose mailbox privileges." We both laughed, but there was frustration behind her smile. "I think people are finally getting tired of it," she added, and she was right. The next 2 days were a whirlwind. More emails rolled in. Some people even came up to the ridge to meet me face to face. I showed them the original lease and answered their questions patiently. Some were surprised, a few were angry, but not at me. At Carol, turns out she hadn't been telling them the whole truth for a long time. One man told me Carol had been using HOA funds to pay for landscaping on her personal property, even though the community guidelines clearly said homeowners were responsible for their own yards. Another woman said Carol had refused to approve a ramp installation for her elderly mother, calling it aesthetic pollution. Little by little, the web Carol had spun started to unravel, but she wasn't done fighting. Late that Friday afternoon, I got a certified letter from a law office, one representing the HOA. It was another cease and desist, accusing me of spreading misinformation and undermining community stability. They demanded I stopped contacting residents and claimed I was trying to illegally acquire influence over the HOA. I rolled my eyes and handed the letter to my lawyer, Eddie. The next morning he read it, set it down and smirked. "This is weak," he said. "It's a scare tactic." Should I respond? He shrugged. "I can handle it, but you have a better option now." "What's that?" "Leverage." He leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. "You've got public support growing. The HOA is rattled. You don't need to play defense anymore. You can go on offense." I knew what he meant. The lease they signed with me had a clause, a rare one, but I'd insisted on it when we made the original deal. It allowed the landowner me to dissolve the lease early if the HOA violated certain terms, namely, misuse of funds, illegal enforcement of rules outside the lease agreement, and slander against the owner. Carol and her crew had checked all three boxes. If I wanted to, I could legally dissolve their entire lease and evict them from the land, forcing them to renegotiate individual plots or leave the subdivision entirely. That wasn't my goal, but it gave me power, and I was ready to use it. So I called for a meeting. I reserved a community hall down in Foxdale Ridge for Sunday afternoon and posted a flyer on every mailbox. I included my name, my reason for calling the meeting, and a clear statement. This is not about kicking people out. This is about restoring truth and ending abuse. I promised to bring documents, answer questions, and explain everyone's options. Moving forward, by Sunday, the room was packed. Some stood against the walls. Others sat in fold-out chairs, whispering to each other. The front, Carol sat at the HOA board table, arms folded, glaring at me like I'd set her house on fire. The other board members looked nervous. They hadn't expected me to show up with confidence or evidence. I stepped to the front and cleared my throat. "Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Granger. I own all 300 acres this subdivision was built on, including the ridge, the forest, and the land under your homes. I've owned it since February of last year, and until now, I've stayed out of your business. But that changed when your HOA president started issuing violations against me on my own property, accusing me of squatting and threatening legal action based on lies." A few heads turned toward Carol. She shifted in her seat but said nothing. "I've brought copies of the deed, the lease agreement, and a list of every violation of that lease your board has committed, starting with public defamation and ending with misuse of HOA funds. Based on the legal agreement, I could dissolve your lease effective immediately." The room fell silent. I let the moment hang for a second, then softened my tone. "But I'm not here to hurt anyone. I know most of you just want to live peacefully. I do too. So I'm offering you a choice." I passed out printed papers to the crowd. One side had the lease clause I referred to. The other had a proposal: dissolve the current HOA board voluntarily and replace it with a new resident-elected community council. In exchange, I would amend the lease to include purchase options for residents, giving them the opportunity to buy the land beneath their homes at a fair price over time. No more confusion. No more threats. True ownership. Neighbor to neighbor. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a man stood up near the back. "My name's Keith," he said. "I've been here 6 years. Carol fined me $300 for planting tomatoes in my backyard." People laughed. He turned to me. "I say, we vote right now." Cheers erupted across the room. Carol jumped to her feet. "This is illegal. You can't just overthrow the board. This isn't how we do things." A woman near the front stood up. "No, Carol, you don't get to tell us how to do things anymore." Someone else shouted, "Let's see the books." And just like that, the tide turned. Carol stormed out, red-faced, but the crowd didn't stop. That afternoon, a vote was held on emergency election. Residents nominated new candidates, passed around ballots, and within an hour, a brand new council was formed. I didn't even have to raise my voice. When it was over, the new council leader, the same woman who had given me lemonade, came up and shook my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up, for being honest." I smiled. "I just wanted to live in peace." She nodded. "You earned it." As the crowd dispersed, I stood alone in the middle of the hall, watching neighbors shake hands, laugh, and talk like people do when they finally feel free. It felt like the end of a war and the beginning of something better. It had been a week since the residents of Foxdale Ridge voted to replace their HOA board, and things had finally started to calm down. I noticed it first in the silence: no more SUVs circling my driveway, no more fake notices taped to my porch, and no Carol standing at the foot of the ridge with her clipboard like she was preparing to invade. Instead, I saw kids riding bikes near the base trail, neighbors chatting across fences, and porch lights glowing softly at night. The tension that once seemed baked into the soil was gone. For the first time in years, people in that neighborhood looked free. But peace wasn't the end of the story. There were still loose ends to tie up, and one of them was a big one. Carol, she hadn't gone quietly. After storming out of the emergency meeting, she went dark for a few days. No one saw her around the neighborhood. Some thought she had left for good. Others said she was lawyering up. Honestly, I didn't care until a notice arrived at my cabin from the county courthouse. Carol had filed a lawsuit against me personally, claiming unlawful eviction of a legally appointed HOA board. abuse of landlord authority, and even defamation of character. She wanted damages, financial compensation for emotional stress, loss of status, and personal trauma. I stared at the paperwork for a while, then calmly picked up the phone and called Eddie. I had a feeling this was coming, he said, already sounding bored. She's bluffing, but we'll respond. She wants a fight. She's going to get facts instead. We met that afternoon in his office. Eddie reviewed the documents, took notes, and said something that stuck with me. See, this isn't about law anymore. It's about pride. You embarrassed her, took away her power. This is the only move she has left. I nodded. Let's shut the door on it then, permanently. So that's what we did. Eddie prepared a motion to dismiss the case based on lack of evidence. We attached everything: the deed, the lease, the signed community vote, even copies of Carol's own letters where she had falsely accused me of trespassing. We included statements from residents. People like Thomas and Janet were more than happy to help. They were tired of Carol's lies. What amazed me was how quickly the community rallied around the truth once it came out. Before, most residents had followed the HOA blindly because it was easier. They didn't want trouble, but once someone stood up to the noise, others found their voices too, and people were talking by the weekend. I'd been invited to 3 different backyard barbecues. Janet brought up a funny idea at one of them, starting a newsletter called Life After Carol, just to poke fun at how tense things had been before. We laughed, but behind the joke was a shared sense of relief. A weight had been lifted. Meanwhile, Carol's lawsuit wasn't going anywhere. Within 2 weeks, the court reviewed our motion and scheduled a hearing. Eddie didn't even need me present. The evidence spoke for itself. She's going to get crushed, he said. Honestly, I don't think she even believes she'll win. She just wants to drag you through the mud. Then let her try, I said. I've got work to do up here. And I did. While all this unfolded, I finally turned my attention back to the reason I moved here in the first place: building a life off the grid. The cabin had good bones, but it needed updates. I spent days hauling lumber, fixing window frames, replacing old wiring with modern solar-compatible systems, and insulating the roof for winter. Night, I'd sit on the porch swing, watch the trees sway in the moonlight, and breathe in that mountain air like medicine. Some evenings I'd walk down the trail and end up chatting with residents along the way. People who once looked at me like a criminal now waved me over, offered drinks, and told stories about what the neighborhood used to be like before the HOA turned sour. There was a man named George, a retired firefighter, who told me we never even had an HOA when we first built here. It was just a few of us. Then they formed one for safety. Next thing we knew, they were measuring the height of our mailboxes. He shook his head, chuckling bitterly. It's funny. We thought we needed someone to keep order. But what we really needed was someone to leave us alone. That line stuck with me. Leave us alone. That's what most people want. To be respected. To be trusted with their own lives. They don't need a clipboard committee breathing down their necks. The new community council had taken over smoothly. They scrapped a long list of ridiculous rules like the ban on flags, the restrictions on lawn chairs, even the one that said you couldn't keep more than 2 flower pots on a porch. They held open meetings, invited feedback, and even started working on plans to transition from lease land to individual ownership, like I'd offered. I told them there was no rush. We could set up payment plans, keep things affordable. I wasn't trying to profit off them. I just wanted stability for them and for me. It was my land, yes, but now it felt like we shared it. Like it was finally a community worth calling one. Then came the final blow to Carol's crusade. The judge dismissed her case completely. Eddie called me right after the ruling. It's over, he said. Full dismissal. The judge even called it meritless. What about costs? I asked. She owes you, Eddie replied. Filing fees, plus legal costs. It's not a huge sum, but it'll sting. I didn't care about the money. I just cared that it was over for good. I drove down to the ridge that afternoon and stopped at the community board near the mailbox cluster. Someone had pinned a handwritten note that said, "Thank you, Daniel." I smiled and added my own sticky note beside it. It read, "I just wanted peace. Glad we all found it." Carol moved out a month later. No one threw a party or said goodbye. She sold her house to a young couple with 2 kids and vanished like a storm cloud clearing the sky. I heard she tried to start another HOA in a town a few miles away. Hopefully the folks over there knew what to watch for. As for me, I stayed. Fall came fast in the mountains. The trees exploded into color-deep oranges, burning reds, golden yellows. I spent most of my days chopping wood, prepping for snow, and finishing up the cabin's new skylight. I even started keeping bees in a small clearing down the slope. Turns out, peace isn't just something you find. It's something you build, slowly, with your own 2 hands. And in the quiet moments, I thought back to how it all started. That first morning, standing on the porch with coffee in hand, watching Carol and her crew march toward me like they owned the place. Their voices loud, their papers flying. So sure, they were in the right. So sure I was an outsider. Funny thing is, they never thought to ask one simple question: who owns this land? Because if they had, everything might have gone differently. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Some battles you don't win with shouting. You win by standing still, holding your ground, and letting the truth do the work. That ridge was mine. It always had been, and now finally it felt like home. The crisp morning air rolled over the hills like a blanket, sunlight brushing the tops of pine trees and glinting off the windows of the cabin. I stood on the porch, a mug of coffee in hand, watching two moving trucks pull up in front of Carol's house. After months of chaos, intimidation, and noise, the silence was more surreal than comforting. But it was finally her, the end. Carol was being evicted, not just from her position but from the very home she claimed she ruled as her. Hired help began carrying out boxes. I leaned against the railing, not out of smugness but to finally breathe free air. The war she started was over and she had lost. Getting here had taken more strength than I anticipated. After the vote to dissolve the HOA's corrupt leadership, Carol didn't go quietly. She launched another round of accusations, not through legal channels this time, but through local gossip, flyers, and emails laced with venom. She accused me of manipulating residents, of faking documents, even of being part of some shady land grab conspiracy. But I had already taken precautions. Every claim she made I'd already answered in court documents. Every lie she spread I countered with proof. Her last attempt was particularly bold. She contacted a local news station with an exclusive scoop that the subdivision was being stolen by a fake landlord who forged lease contracts. I didn't respond at first, let her dig her own hole. When the reporter called me, I invited him over. That weekend, we filmed a full walkthrough of the property. I showed the reporter the land titles, tax records, the original development deal, and most importantly, the lease contracts signed by the HOA board including Carol. The news segment aired 3 days later, and it crushed whatever remained of Carol's credibility. She'd screamed about lies and injustice for weeks, but all it took was a single televised walkthrough to show the truth. Suddenly, the same neighbors who once echoed her paranoia were posting online, "We had no idea, she misled us. We're so sorry." Daniel. Then came the vote for a new council. For the first time, residents stepped up, not the board's friends, not the loudest complainers, but real people who cared about the community. A retired school teacher, a young couple with kids, a firefighter who volunteered locally, they were elected unanimously. Their first act, invite me to a community dinner. To thank you, they said, for protecting the land and standing up to her. That night we set up folding tables under the oak trees by the subdivision park. Kids ran around with glow sticks. Someone played guitar, and neighbors brought homemade food. It didn't feel like a celebration, it felt like healing. Carol didn't attend. She was still in her house, packing in a rage. Her eviction had become inevitable after she failed to pay her lease fees for 3 months straight. Claiming she didn't owe a dime to a fake landlord, she stopped all payments, ironically giving me the final legal reason to terminate her agreement. I followed every step legally, respectfully, and fairly. The court gave her 30 days. She used 29 to sulk, threaten, and stall. On the 30th, the sheriff showed up with the order in hand, and that's where I was now watching her go. She didn't make eye contact when she came out, dressed in a blue sweater and worn jeans. Her once confident posture now slumped, a box in her arms, another on the porch behind her. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say, but just before she stepped into her car, she turned around and glared at me one last time. "You destroyed everything," she hissed. I didn't flinch. "No, Carol, you did. I just stopped you from taking down everyone else with you." Her eyes flickered, as if realizing the truth for the first time. She looked past me at the trees, the cabin, the open sky, and for a second, I thought she might actually apologize. But she just shook her head and got in the car. A few minutes later, she was gone. The neighborhood changed after that. You could feel it. No more flyers on doors accusing people of imaginary rule violations. No more absurd threats over grass length or mailbox colors. The new council allowed people to have a say, and more importantly, respected them. A few homeowners came forward to ask if they could eventually buy the land their homes sat on. I agreed. I even offered them generous terms, far better than market value. I didn't want to profit off them. I wanted them to finally feel home. Some cried when I told them they'd be able to own the plots outright in the next few years. One woman hugged me and said, "For the first time in 10 years, I feel safe here." I resumed living quietly in the cabin. My days were filled with peace, something I once thought I'd lost forever. I'd wake up to the chirping of birds, hike the ridge trail, or sit with a book by the lake. Every now and then, neighbors would drop by with homemade bread or just to say hello. One afternoon, the firefighter council member brought his son over. "This is Mr. Daniel," he told the boy. "He's the reason we still have a home." I smiled and crouched down. "Nah, I'm just the guy who refused to be pushed around." Weeks passed, then months. The drama that once consumed our lives faded into memory. People planted gardens. Kids built a treehouse. The community felt alive again, not fearful, not bitter, just real. I stayed out of the council's way, except when asked for advice. I'd become more than a landlord. I was a neighbor, a protector, and to some, even a friend. But I also made one final change. At the edge of the subdivision entrance, where once stood a crumbling wooden sign that read Foxtail Ridge HOA, I replaced it with a new metal plaque that read Brightwood Meadows, a place owned with heart, not ruled with fear. Underneath it, in small letters, land generously leased by Daniel Granger. I didn't need to be praised or remembered as a hero. I just wanted this place to live and breathe on its own. No more tyrants, no more power-hungry boards, just a place where people respected each other and their land, the land I never gave up on. And in the end, I didn't just protect my home, I gave hundreds of others a chance to feel at home, too. 4 more stories that reveal the truth behind power, justice, and second chances. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube.